Fighting Through Podcast, episode 126, Christmas at War 2025. Fighting Through Podcast, where the real Christmassy is. He held the orange for a moment, just staring at it. Then he handed it over to my mother, who took it in her hands as if it were a delicate piece of glassware or a figurine, gazed at it, and then brought it up towards her face with both hands. I leapt up from my seat to the Astrodome, where I could see the starboard engines were on fire. As I switched over from radio to intercom, I saw that a fire had started under the navigator's table on the floor just behind the pilot. It was soon burning fiercely. The pilot gave the order to abandon the aircraft. One of the prisoners said "Merry Christmas" to me in German, and he was crying, and that always stuck in my mind. Hello again, and another warm Yuletide welcome to the Fighting Through Second World War podcast. I'm Bill Cheall, and the aim of this podcast is to share family stories, memoirs and interviews with veterans in all the countries and all the forces. I dare you to pull a cracker while you're listening and not make yourself jump. In today's episode, I've got a children at war story about a girl in German-occupied Guernsey, and I'm going to be sharing a poignant family letter from a Canadian flyer staying in the east of England. And in listening to that intro music, the carol, that was being sung in Clipsby Church, where that very same flyer would have attended all those years ago during World War II. We've got a few more newspaper headlines from the time. And I've also got a Christmas present for everyone who listens. More on that later. Secret. And not necessarily last or even least, we've got a New Year's 1944 war story based on the last flight of a Lancaster, featuring memoirs from Jim Donnan. And just to set the ball rolling, we're going to have a stop press special with me doing a random read through one of the newspapers from December the 20th 1941, so just coming up to Christmas. And this is the Daily Express, by the way, and you know, it's amazing how much stuff is being reported on from all over the world. The headline on this particular newspaper is "Hong Kong Garrison Fight to the Last." So this is the war against the Japanese, and the subheading is "Final Stand at Picnic Mountain Turned into a Gibraltar. Hong Kong fighting to the death with swarms of Japanese who landed yesterday at many points on the island. Rejected with scorn a third offer of surrender terms, and then came silence. Late last night it was officially announced in London, the report from Japanese sources that Hong Kong has been in Japanese hands since this morning cannot be confirmed or denied, as no communication has been received from the colony since early this morning. So that's not going to be a very good Christmas for anybody in Hong Kong. But basically they were making a last stand at Victoria Peak, a fortified picnic resort. And then another headline: the Germans are still on the run in Libya, North Africa. By last night they'd retreated over 70 miles in 3 days and were still falling back, pursued by the British in every sector. Rommel's forces are split. And a little inset story here. Rommel escapes in boat. It was unofficially reported to me in London last night that General Rommel has escaped from Bomber in a motorboat after the defeat of his Libya army. If this proves true, it is probable that the German commander would be landed further down the coast towards Benghazi. Of course, Rommel did fight again in North Africa. There were one or two more battles that he fought in, so getting away on that motorboat meant he could make his return further along the coast. And of course, this is before the America's in the war, but again, this newspaper is total havoc in terms of where the stories are. Here's an interesting one: 7 million US men to march. New York, Friday. 7 million Americans will march to war during the next year. That was the expectation in Washington tonight as Congress adopted a compromise conscription bill. The Senate and House of Representatives agreed to call men aged 20 to 44 inclusive into military service. Before the Japanese attack on Hawaii, the American Army had reached a figure somewhere near 1.5 million men, and at least 500,000 more were in the Navy. Now, when I was previewing this, I saw another story about the Americans. Yes, because of course that previous bit was all about the follow-up to Pearl Harbor when the Americans decided to enter the war, and on the back page here we've got 30 minutes would have saved Hawaii, Knox. Colonel Frank Knox, US Navy Secretary, said today that 30 minutes warning of the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, Hawaii would have made all the difference. The third and final wave of the Japanese bombers met such a barrage from every gun and every ship that they had to... I can't see this next word. I don't know. That they had to sneak on or something like that. And not a single torpedo did the slightest damage to ships or equipment ashore. Colonel Knox said, "We ought to have been on guard against treachery. If we'd remembered Japan's record, we should not have been surprised." Here's an interesting advert here. "Farewell till victory." This is a Fry's assorted chocolates advert, and it's a picture of a toffee or something with a big cross through it, and it says perfection in touch, in timing, in detail. That was the skill that made Fry's assorted chocolates, and this is the skill that the nation needs today for more vital and important tasks. And basically, Fry's are happy to release their most highly trained workers, and you, they feel assured, will willingly forego your favourite assortment until victory is won. In the meantime, Fry's will devote their resources to their famous block chocolate, which requires less skilled labour to produce. And so it goes on. So all in a good cause. We give up our strawberry creams and caramels. On the back page here we've got Russians smash on past dead Germans. So this is an earlier stage of the war, obviously. This is December 41, and this is before the war, the battle in Stalingrad or anything that we heard in a few episodes back. And this is about Moscow, and it says, smashed houses, wrecked German tanks and cars, abandoned soup kitchens and frozen bodies half visible under the steadily falling snow tell the story of the German retreat from the Moscow front. I've been making a trip along the narrow Moscow-Leningrad road to the front, visiting several points where the German rearguard tried in vain to hold the irresistible Russian advance, and Russian reserves and supplies were moving up the road towards the battle lines. Transports, plodding infantry, dispatch riders mounted on horseback, and wagons, trucks and sledges with food and munitions clogged the road. Gosh. There you go. You didn't think you were going to hear another gosh from me for another 6 months, didn't you? Oh dear. Right, this is the last one in this newspaper. This is quite interesting, this one. It's a footnote almost. Woman kills 2 German soldiers. Stockholm, Friday. A 33-year-old Russian woman, Maria Marutalev, confessed in Brussels today that she killed 2 German soldiers by stabbing them in a dark street. Soon after her arrest, a German NCO was found stabbed in a wood. Reprisals are threatened. So there you go, that's a Russian resistance for you, operating in Brussels. Yeah, we'll leave it there for now. I might come back to 1 or 2 newspapers later on in the episode. It's anecdote time now. My stepdaughter Abby bought me a little lemon tree for my birthday last year, and it came with 3 green lemons on it, just small ones. It took a bit of, it's a house plant. It took a bit of nurturing with water and fertiliser, but eventually the lemons turned yellow and grew a little bigger. They were nothing like the size of supermarket lemons, and at one point I thought maybe they weren't growing properly. But it got to the point where I thought, give it a try. I plucked up the courage to gently twist one off its stalk. It came away fairly easily, which is a good sign, with a little smell of fresh lemon zest coming from it. I gave it a rinse under the tap and dried it with a towel. And Julie took it to meet Abby. We were having a meal together, and we ordered a nice bottle of cold, sparkling water with the meal, and decided to try the lemon out in it there and then. So we cut it open with a knife. It smelt beautiful when I sliced it open. We both took a little taste of one slice, and it tasted beautifully sweet, not the horrible sour taste you get from some of the supermarkets. So we popped a few slices in our sparkling water and savoured it, each and every drop, and I'll never forget that sweet flavour. It was a nice little ritual. And this leads me to the first story, which features both lemons and oranges at the height of war. You will recall a while back that Heidi Langbein Allen shared her father Villy's memoirs with us, Save the Last Bullet, about a 14-year-old dad being drafted into the German war effort. Heidi has recently finished another book called Lost Youth, The Horrors of World War II, Seen Through Young Eyes, and it's due out next year, and if any publishers are listening, do get in touch. The book is a series of short stories, and this is one about Jill, a young girl from Guernsey, who gets caught up in the Nazi occupation of her home island. In the not-too-distant future, I'm hoping to share the full story with you, but for now, here's a short segment from it. Here goes. I was only 6 in 1941, on the day our lives changed forever. We lived on the little island of Guernsey, one of the British Channel Islands between England and France. Somebody knocked on our front door. When my parents opened it, a German officer and 2 armed soldiers politely introduced themselves and asked to come in. Of course, no one had the choice to say no. My father stepped aside and steered them to the living room. I stood next to my mother, close to the back wall. It was confusing for me to see my parents' anxiety and worry, their pale, serious faces and stiff bodies, and a feeling of foreboding came over me. The Germans started asking questions about the house and property. They asked who owned the house, how many bedrooms it had, and so on. It wasn't long before their reason for being there became clear. In a firm, declaratory tone, that suggested we should be honoured that the German government was interested in our home, the officer stated, "We are requisitioning this house to be used for some of our officers. You will be required to vacate the premises by tomorrow." Mum's eyes widened and she started to say something, but Dad put his hand on her arm to stop her. The officer said they appreciated my parents' cooperation, nodded towards my mother, and then the 3 Germans turned and walked out the door. I didn't realise then that I'd spend the next 3 years of my life in German captivity. Long story short, a number of the Guernsey population was deported to Germany. Jill eventually found herself in a camp called Biberach, after the town where it was located. As I looked around, I noticed the buildings were similar to those in Dorsten, where we'd been previously, but these were made of concrete. We were led through the gate and into the camp. There was a building towards the middle. It was more than 1 story tall, but the rest were mostly long, dormitory-type buildings. Beyond the barbed wire fencing, I could see different buildings. I assumed those buildings were part of a town near this place. I looked off in the distance and I could see a river, which I later learned was called the Ries. We were south of the Black Forest. You could even see the Swiss Alps. At least the surrounding area wasn't as bleak as Dorsten. As we lined up for roll call, a frigid wind blew and snow covered everything. The wind had that cutting chill that comes over you if you've been in that kind of weather. My mother must have looked down and seen me shivering. She wrapped a wool or horsehair blanket around me and pinned it in the front with a large metal safety pin. I still remember how icy cold that big safety pin felt on my chest. One thing everyone knew for sure was that winter hadn't even arrived yet in the middle of November, and the weather was about to get much worse. I imagine that most of the adults had concluded by then that we'd not be home by Christmas. After a general roll call, they lined us up in single file. Then we had to walk up to a table where German officers were sitting. They were taking everyone's information to register us at the camp. We were led away in groups and taken to different dorm buildings. Each room had 16 bunks, but there were over 16 people in each room. My brother and I climbed up onto one bunk to claim our space. The mattresses were made of straw and covered with a thin layer of sackcloth or burlap. We started bouncing on the fluffier mattress until Mother scolded us for flattening it. I was starving. We got used to the meagre food. It was usually a thin soup made with small bits of cabbage, which rarely had anything else in it. Sometimes, if we were lucky, it had a few small pieces of meat floating in it. Once someone brought a bag into our dorm and set it on the table. One of the ladies took several loaves of dark bread from the bag and placed them on the table. I got distracted and looked away for a moment, but the tone in the ladies' voices caught my attention. I don't remember what they said, but they were words of disgust. When I looked at the bread, a lady had cut slices from one of the loaves, and I could see things moving in the bread. The ladies shook their heads and matter-of-factly began picking out maggots. By December 1942, everyone realised we would not be going back home by Christmas. The Germans had allowed the camp to bring in a couple of Christmas trees from the town. There were no lights for the trees, but everyone decorated them with a little bit of everything. Sometimes the decorations were just a piece of cloth tied into a bow. We used coloured paper from the Red Cross packages and folded it to look like a bird. Just having a tree lifted people's spirits a little. On Christmas Day, my father was able to come to our barracks to spend the afternoon with us. He had the Red Cross package that had been given to us and set it on the table. He opened the package with slow and careful movements and started pulling items out of the box one by one. First, he placed a can of milk on the table, then a few other things. Then he pulled an orange from the box and smiled. My eyes widened and I stretched as far as I could to see if there were any more oranges, but the box was empty. I sat back down, and I'm sure I wore a frown on my face. He held the orange for a moment, just staring at it. Then he handed it over to my mother, who took it in her hands as if it were a delicate piece of glassware or a figurine, gazed at it, and then brought it up towards her face with both hands. I watched her as she closed her eyes. She brought it to her nose, drew a long breath, and held it. She still had her eyes closed as she moved the orange and held it against her cheek. Then she lowered her hands, opened her eyes, and continued to stare at it for a bit. Turning towards me, she handed me the orange. I took it and did the same thing I'd seen her do. I held it up to my nose and sniffed it to see if I remembered what one smelled like. My father held out his hand, and I started to hand it back to him, but pulled my hand back at the last second. He smiled and motioned for me to give it to him. I laughed, and without saying anything, handed it across the table to him. I turned to my mother and said, "Shall we?" She nodded, saying nothing. I watched father peel the orange. He took his time pulling small pieces of the peel off and laying them on the table. My mother gathered up the pieces as he sat each one down. She used the peels later to add some flavouring to drinks or something. Very little, if anything, was thrown away, if you could think of another use for it. When my father had finished, he held the orange in his hand again and turned it from side to side as if examining it for flaws. Maybe he was just admiring its beauty. When you're in situations like we were, it's easy to find beauty in the simplest things. He pulled at the centre and then began separating the small wedges. He first handed one to my mother, then one to me and one to my brother. I made that first wedge last 4 bites, taking small tiny ones so it would last. There were 2 orange wedges for each of us. When I was down to the last bite of my second wedge, I chewed it until there wasn't anything left of it. I savoured it almost like a piece of hard candy that slowly disappears in your mouth. So, next time you're contemplating eating an orange or a lemon, wash it, dry it, worship it. Think how lucky we are to have as many as we want on demand. Cut it open with a sharp knife and sink your teeth into that juicy, sweet flesh. The oranges... the origins of the story are David Treadway's book One Orange for Christmas and an interview between Heidi and the girl, now adult, Jill Pay Oliver, taken from a new book by Heidi, which is due out next year, Lost Youth, The Horrors of World War II, Seen Through Young Eyes. I'll keep you updated on that. A few shout-outs and coffees coming up. Many thanks to Jerry Marquesos, who sponsored the show through a Ko-fi donation. And Jerry said, ages ago, me mentioned Mrs. Beaton's book of household management in the show, and after buying the book, Jerry is complaining that he's got feelings of inadequacy when measuring up his housekeeping abilities against Mrs. Beaton. And he says, I got about 10% of the way through, and now I have such anxiety about my incompetence at conducting household social affairs that I don't think I could properly manage inviting my best friend over for ice and water and crackers. And Jerry, perchance a slice of fresh lemon to add to that. But he said, I want to read the rest of the book, but stress and fear have thus far rendered me unable to pry open the cover. Thanks for that chuckle, Jerry. And he's from Weed Sport in New York State. Thank you for the Spotify reviews by Kyle Romanishan and Mealy Dog, who said, on the China-Burma-India supply route, you commented, love this episode. My father was a hump pilot. One of my favourite stories of his was the Chinese villagers following him and rubbing his arms. They were fascinated by his hairy arms. The episode background there is the Able Queen, Tales of an Indiana Hump Pilot Lost in the Himalayas, episode 77. Thank you to Terry Hardman on Spotify, David Edward Lynn, Frost TT, P. Breen, Chris D, and finally Ranger RFC1 has posted a few comments, and thank you, Ranger. Janice Blake, thank you for your enthusiastic review. Simply the very best World War II pod, Ron Kidwells. And someone called Australia on Top on Apple said, I started listening during the pandemic and was hooked ever since. Keep up the good work. Eva Lorien from Canada said, my father was a British para. Just hearing Paul's accent reminds me of my dad. Please keep the episodes coming, Paul. All the best, your friend in Canada, Eva Lorien. Feedback now from Bruce Moffat in Canada, Grand Prairie, Alberta. We've got quite a Canada thing going on at the moment, haven't we? Come on, the Canucks. Bruce said, being born only 8 years after the war, World War II was very fresh on every Canadian mind. Growing up, I vividly remember memories of our Legion members marching, usually on a snowy Canadian winter day, down the main street of our tiny village. My father was able to finally get to England in the Army of the Occupation as a chaplain, as he had to finish his studies in University Saskatchewan and missed the action. Like my father, my Uncle Ken volunteered, but because of his high grades in university, he was not allowed to go over. He then decided to start failing his classes in order to join up. One of his fellow students went to the recruitment office and said, you need to let this guy go over, and relayed the story to him. They decided to let him join up, and he was preparing to go over when he got the news that the war was over and Germany had surrendered. My Uncle Ken said it was like they heard he was coming. He later joined the Air Force and served overseas and in Canada in the RCAF, serving throughout the Cold War on radar bases as a sergeant. I'm also very proud of my goddaughter, Captain Jennifer Hillman, who just retired from the Canadian Forces and also served our country as a major just before she retired. So yeah, that's from Bruce Moffat, Grand Prairie, Alberta. Thank you, Bruce. Sorry, I'm rattling through these now, but do you know, I'm in a hurry because it's Christmas coming up, and I can't believe it's only 2 days to Christmas as I record this. Well, at least that's what my chocolate advent calendar suggests. But anyway, I've got a good joke at the end. I hope it's better than that one was. Stuart Hawksworth wrote in, I joined the RAF in 1974 when I was a cocky 16-year-old and remembered having an argument with the flight leader about the pronunciation of, wait for it, lieutenant. I'd been brought up on comics and American war films, so I insisted that the correct way was flight lieutenant, and he insisted that it was flight lieutenant. I must have said something smart. So when we had marched down to the training workshops, the flight leader took me behind the shed and gave me a fat lip to match the smart lip I'd used on him. I remembered the correct pronunciation from then on. Oh dear, thank you, Stuart. I'll add that Stuart did give me some great feedback on the show, and thank you very much for that. Very constructive. More on the Canadians now. Where I live in Norfolk, I'm just up the road from a place called Clipsby, and a letter has fallen into my hands from a Canadian chap who was stationed at Clipsby during the war, and this letter is a letter home to his parents. It's December the 23rd, 1941. A little bit of background before I read the letter, but in December 41, Canadian airmen stationed in Norfolk in England were almost certainly there as part of the Royal Canadian Air Force's contribution to the RAF's Bomber Command, or maybe the Coastal Command, or even fighter squadrons operating under British control. And by late 41, the RCAF had several squadrons integrated into Bomber Command, flying from East Anglia and nearby counties. And Norfolk, this county, was home to many bomber airfields because of the proximity to the North Sea and occupied Europe. So any number of dangers this young man might have been going through. And let's read a little bit more now with the letter itself, which reads as follows. Dear Mum and Dad, by the time you receive this, Christmas will have been forgotten, but here we're just beginning to get that holiday spirit. Last night I went to a very wonderful dinner party at the home of some friends who live not far from the base. The enclosed menu and place card will give you an idea of how nice it was. The dinner party was held last night instead of on Christmas Day because the host's daughters are all in the WAF, the Women's Auxiliary Air Force, and are on duty Christmas Day. The family is an extremely nice one. They own the munitions factory in town and have a beautiful home and a 125-ton yacht, which the Navy now has, and a Swiss governess who's lived with them for about 22 years. She raised the children. She's quite an old girl, reminds me of Mrs. Aguido. She rules the household with an iron hand and a heart of gold. The dinner was really something special. The turkey weighed 20 pounds for the 12 of us. The sausages were roasted with the turkey, and like nothing I've ever tasted. The Yorkshire pudding, well, it was a real one, and would have been a sufficient meal unto itself. St. Julien wine, vintage 1926, was served with the meal. It was brought from France by Mr. Bowes about 10 or 12 years ago, and has been in their wine cellar ever since. Marianne, the governess, the name means godmother, served the Christmas pudding herself. All the lights were extinguished, except one small candle on the sideboard. The pudding is taken from the oven at the very last moment. A sprig of holly was stuck in the top, a bottle of brandy poured on and then lit. It burned with a blue flame as it was brought out in triumph. Just as the pudding was being blown out, we heard children's voices outside. 3 little girls sang carols outside the window. They sang Silent Night and God Rest You Merry Gentlemen. Then Marianne called them in for some candy. They had an antique iron lantern with a candle burning inside, and were all wrapped up in muffles and looked exactly like they'd just stepped out of the picture on a Christmas card. Their noses and cheeks were all red from the cold. They sure were cute. They were collecting money for the British Red Cross, so we gave them all the lucky coins in the pudding, and some others besides. So they asked us what carol we would like to hear. Glyn, a Welsh girl, requested Good King Wenceslas. It really seemed like a real old English merry Yuletide. The mince pies were small individual ones, and the pie crust was the closest to Mum's that I've ever had. The liqueur brandy was the last bottle of it in their cellar. The vintage was 1902, and it was really priceless. Now I know what connoisseurs mean by bouquet in a liqueur. When we finally left the table, I couldn't have eaten as much as a peanut. After dinner, we sat around the fire, unable to move, and smoked imported Russian cigarettes. It was an occasion I'll always remember. Tonight is our Christmas party in the Officers' Club. The club's all decorated. Should be a good party with dancing, a good band, ice cream, cake, etc. We're going to have another turkey dinner on Christmas Day in the mess, and I'm invited to other parties on Christmas Day and on Boxing Day. Boxing Day is December the 26th. No one seems to know why it's so called, but it's a national holiday when everyone takes a day off. No trains or buses, everything is closed up. So, you can see that my Christmas is a very good one, in spite of everything. I just wish that Bob could be a tenth as well off as I am. All these good times are really appreciated, but they don't entirely make up for being away from home. As far as I'm concerned, Christmas is the one day that has to be spent at home to be right. In the meanwhile, our routine goes on as much as usual. Our mail was nil for 3 weeks. Then yesterday I received 21 letters and cards. The parcel with Mum's picture arrived. It looked very natural and close to home. I thoroughly appreciated having it. I won't get around to answering all that mail for a couple of days, but I'll tackle it as soon as I can. That darned Public Relations Office notice in the paper certainly must have given you some wrong ideas about my tour here. Look, I have a very small fraction of the number of missions it mentions. It's too bad that in avoiding breaking customary regulations they give an entirely wrong picture. My coat is still at the tailor's being mended and patched. I believe that it's going to be okay. The shirt is a perfect fit, and it's now about ready for a trip to the cleaners. I wear the sweater every day too. If I don't close now, I'll never get this posted in tomorrow's mail, so I'll go now. My thoughts are not far from all of you at 1018 Maple at any time, but especially right now. My love and best wishes to you all, Steve. You'll notice mention was made of Boxing Day in that article, and I know from living in England, the background to Boxing Day is that it was the day when certain workers opened their boxes. The boxes contained gratuities or bonuses earned during the year at their place of work, and they were saved up until the day after Christmas Day, hence the term Boxing Day, unless you, listener, know different. And there's further information about the activities of Canadian servicemen in Norfolk in the show notes on the website. A little bit more from the newspapers now. Daily Herald, Christmas Eve, December the 24th, 1942. This is the main headline. Non-stop, 16,400 captives taken in a day. Russians push on 18 miles, capture many places. Heavy Klim Voroshilov tanks are leading the pursuit of a beaten enemy who's retreating with all haste in the Great Don Bend. A special communique tonight announced an advance of from 12 to 18 miles during the day, making a total of nearly 100 miles since the offensive began. No fewer than 16,400 prisoners were taken today. The grand total for 8 days is now 36,600. The number of German casualties is also swiftly mounting, and on Tuesday the enemy left on the battlefield about 8,000 dead. Dozens of more places have been recaptured. Messages from the front say that at some points the Germans are going back in complete disorder. Villages and roads are littered with abandoned tanks, guns and lorries. So this is around the time of Stalingrad, the Battle of Stalingrad, and there's a little headline near this. "Get near enemy" was the slogan. "Get nearer the enemy, it's safer," has been the slogan of the Russians in the Stalingrad street fighting. This lesson of close-quarter fighting was stressed by General Chukov, the man who for 4 months held Stalingrad against the Germans. "Fighting like this," he told a British United Press correspondent on the Stalingrad front, "requires the greatest initiative from every officer and man. The nearer the enemy, the smaller the losses. Artillery and planes invariably hit their own troops if the distance between trenches and positions is small. The most awful battle took place on October the 14th, after Hitler made his speech ordering the capture of Stalingrad regardless of the cost." We'll move on from that, and this is a curious article. This is about the Home Guard, sort of. Faced by an Air Ministry inquiry, London Home Guard confesses, "I wasn't on raid." Mr. Eric Fraser, the Home Guard Battery Sergeant Major of Mildenhall Road, Clapton, did not go on the Duisburg raid on Sunday night. He did not, as has been claimed, fly in a Halifax bomber or any other bomber over Germany. He did not act as a rear gunner or any other kind of gunner. And if he felt airsick, as according to a widely circulated report, he had not the slightest excuse for doing so. Last night a written confession, signed by Mr. Fraser, was in the hands of the Air Ministry. It admitted that he was never in an aeroplane which raided Germany. And so it goes on. So that basically this guy has been telling all his pals that he's been on an impromptu air raid. Ah, gosh. Yeah, that's it. That's the crux of it. Some guy, some con artist, really just trying to have his 15 minutes of fame. The Daily Herald, in common with other national newspapers, will not be published on either Christmas Day or Boxing Day. So that's why we're reading this one from the 24th. And this is a good cartoon. There's two good ones, actually, on the inside. The first one is called Santa Hitler, and it's there's a Christmas tree, and Hitler dressed up as Santa Claus next to the Christmas tree, looking down at three bawling children. and one of the little boys has a swastika on his black T-shirt, and there's a little sign underneath the Christmas tree which says "For my people," but the presents hanging off the Christmas tree, there's sort of various impressions of bomb blasts, various shells, Airsats coffee, there's a dead chicken, I think that's got the Airsats label next to it, a book of Mein Kampf, a tank, and so on. So a bit of sarcasm there. And then there's another one. This is by Gilbert Wilkinson, his What a War column. And there's a nicely dressed lady standing on the porch, speaking to her husband, pipe in hand, a gun, and his Home Guards uniform. And he's absolutely piled up with gear. And she's saying to him, "Don't be late, darling. Remember, you've got to dress up tonight." Obviously as Santa Claus. Oh dear. Right. Yeah, we'll put that one behind us as well now. Time to move on to another family story. This one's another Canadian story, and the chap posted it in Reddit. There's a link in the show notes. My grandfather served in World War II, and a local paper published this part of his memoirs about Christmas during wartime, and thought someone might enjoy reading it, even if it's just to hear about Canada's secret weapon. Being away from home over Christmas can be gut-wrenching. This was particularly true during the First and Second World Wars, but Canadian soldiers made the most of it and adapted. My grandfather enlisted in 89th Field Battery in the fall of 1939, so early on, and did his basic training in Fredericton in New Brunswick. When he deployed to Europe, he joined the 5th Regiment Royal Canadian Horse Artillery. Morrison survived the Second World War, suffering only a fractured ankle, an injury that occurred in September 1944 while serving in Italy. His foot became lodged in large pieces of rubble during heavy enemy artillery fire. With Christmas Eve just a day away, here are his wartime recollections from one of his favourite times of the year. Christmas 1939, Battery moved from Woodstock to exhibition buildings in Fredericton for basic training, foot drill, rifle drill, PT, guard duty, kitchen fatigue, street patrols at night, but orderlies by day, etc. Our basic pay was $1.25 per day, and most of this was assigned to your family at home. Fire destroyed the barracks in November 1939. The battery was split up. Our group was in York Hotel, trained in armoury. It was my first Christmas away from home. Married men were allowed leave at Christmas, single men at New Year's. I was on street patrol, but had a very nice dinner at the hotel. The battery had a bear for a mascot. After the fire, we kept him in a shed at the hotel. Johnny and I took some scraps that day to feed him. Being cold, the bear wanted to hibernate and was in a foul mood. He attacked Johnny and started to maul him. Johnny grabbed an old cast-iron griddle hanging on the wall and hit him over the head. End of scuffle. One other time, the bear got his head caught in a cream can and nearly wrecked the mess hall before he got it off. Oh dear. Time for a great adventure now. The last flight of Lancaster B3 DV189, and this is by a wireless operator of said Lancaster, Jim Donnan, and it was on the BBC People's War website. And we joined 550 Squadron on its formation at Waltham, Grimsby, UK on the 25th of November 1943, having transferred from 12 Squadron at Wickenby, where we'd flown on operations from September through to November. Our last 3 operations there had also taken us to Berlin. As New Year's Day was drawing to a close, we were preparing for take-off, and at 14 minutes past midnight we were airborne and on our way at last, climbing to our operational height, heading east over the North Sea. As we approached the Dutch coast, we could see the anti-aircraft defences were very active, and we became alert to the dangers ahead. Flying over Germany, occasional bursts of flak and flashes lit up the thick, unbroken cloud along the route. While searching the night fighter waveband, I was aware of considerable activity by the German control. We found it necessary to keep a sharp lookout, even though our trip had been uneventful so far. Our navigator called for a slight change in course for the final leg to Berlin, as we reached a position between Hanover and Bremen. It was almost immediately afterwards that a series of thuds vibrated through the floor, and the aircraft seemed to bank away to starboard. I leapt up from my seat to the astrodome, where I could see the starboard engines were on fire. As I switched over from radio to intercom, I saw that a fire had started under the navigator's table on the floor just behind the pilot. It was soon burning fiercely. The pilot gave the order to abandon the aircraft. I clipped on my parachute, and as I moved forward it was found that the front escape hatch would not open. The engineer joined the bomb aimer in trying to release it. As I stood behind the navigator, waiting to exit, the rear gunner said that he was having trouble with the rear turret. I then signalled that I'd go over to the rear exit. The navigator was standing beside the pilot, ready to exit, as I scrambled over the main spar and along the fuselage to the rear door, losing my shoes on the way. When I got there, the mid-upper gunner was ready to leave, and the rear gunner was out of his turret and preparing to come forward. I then jettisoned the rear door as the flames from the starboard wing streamed past, licking the tailplane. Grasping the release handle on my parachute, I was preparing to jump, but I must have lost consciousness, as I have no recollection of what happened next or how I left the plane. When I regained consciousness, my parachute was already open, and I was floating in pitch darkness, very cold, and my feet were freezing. I seemed to be a long time coming down, but as I descended through the clouds, dark shadows appeared, and I landed on soft ground in an open space. Gathering up my parachute, I dashed over to a clump of trees, where I sat on the ground shivering and wondering how I could avoid capture. I removed all the identification from my battle dress, put padding from my Mae West inside my socks, and after disposing of my unwanted equipment, I set off walking to get away from the area where I'd landed. The ground was very soft and wet, and there was no sound of any activity in the area. It was still dark, and I appeared to be going around in circles. Snow had been falling for a while, and I was very wet and cold. I then stumbled across a tool shed, where I was able to shelter, and I found a pair of wooden clogs. When daylight came, I could see that the shed was at the side of a track which ran through a peat cutting area with blocks of peat stacked along the side. I ventured out, keeping to the countryside and away from the roads. I was very thirsty and decided to look for a more populated area where I could get help. I made my way along a narrow country road until I could see what looked like farm buildings in the distance. I made my way towards the buildings, and although the area appeared to be inhabited, there was no one about. I rested in a cowshed until evening. I really knew that I could not go on without help. My feet and legs were swollen, and the clogs were useless. As there did not appear to be anyone about, I decided to go out in search of food and drink. I'd not gone far when I was challenged by a man who came out and said something I did not understand. I indicated that I wanted something to drink. I was taken into a kitchen and given food and drink. Various people came and asked me questions that I could not understand, so I did not try to answer. After some time there, I was taken to a coffee house and given a glass of beer, whilst further discussion took place between the people there. Soon afterwards, a lady came in and spoke to me in English. I couldn't take in what she was saying, but I replied, "Oh, you speak English." She then told me that she thought that I was a British airman and asked me why I had not got any shoes on. She said that someone would come to see me. It wasn't long after that when 2 men in uniform arrived and I was taken into custody. The following day I was interviewed by a Luftwaffe officer at the nearby Flugplatz. He told me who I was and asked me where I'd been since the crash. He asked me if I would like to know about my comrades, saying that they'd all been accounted for, but 2 had been killed in the crash. It was then that I found that the engineer and bomb aimer were with me at the same Flugplatz. They were able to assist me when we were taken under armed guard by train to Dunkirk Luft at Frankfurt, where we met up with our 2 air gunners. After spending several days there, we were transported by rail in cattle trucks to Stalag 4B at Mühlberg on the Elbe, where we remained until the end of the war. In May 1990, I met Dick Breedich, who was very interested in researching aircraft sites between 1940 and 45 in Holland. Dick very kindly volunteered to help locate where my aircraft had crashed in Germany, and after very thorough and painstaking research he established that the aircraft had crashed between the villages of Schweringen and Holtrop near Bremen. He'd communicated with many local historians and people in the area, and as a result of his investigations, an article was published in the local German newspaper Die Harke, of which the following are translated extracts. Friedrich Deicher, the bomber crash in January 1944, almost became a catastrophe for Schweringen. In the middle 40s, hundreds of 4-engined Lancaster bombers flew over the territory of Nürnberg to transport their deadly cargo towards Berlin and other cities. Not just a few were attacked by German fighters and shot down. It happened to the 7 crew members of a Lancaster that started out a few minutes after the end of New Year's Day from Waltham, Grimsby, and belonged to 550 Squadron. 2.5 hours later, it was shot down near Nürnberg by a night fighter. 2 crew members were killed. 5 bailed out by parachute. Friedrich Deicher and Heinrich Eichhoff were in 1944 only 15 and 16 years old and lived in Holtrop. They haven't forgotten that New Year's evening of 1944. There was an air raid alarm, and Eichhoff had just returned home from a party in Sebenhausen. It was a soggy cold night when the sirens started to shriek. Suddenly there was a loud explosion like I've never heard, he says. Outside it was as clear as day, and there was fire everywhere. In the cellar, the preserves fell from the shelves. Immediately the word spread around that a bomber had crashed and exploded, and some airmen had bailed out by parachute. Friedrich Diker, who was 15 years old at the time, says that when his father looked out, he suddenly stared at a sea of fire. The deafening explosion blew open doors, plaster fell from the walls, windows shattered, and roofs were ripped off. The bomber was blown into thousands of pieces. The 4 motors were found hundreds of metres away in a field near Schweringen. The crash place was turned into a deep crater, Diker remembers. Heinrich Bochmann, who was barely 14 years old at the time, is now the Burgermeister of Holtrup and Schweringen, where he was born. He states, "I can vividly remember the day the British bomber crashed. It crashed with its complete bomb load, causing a huge crater, with wreckage parts scattered over a wide area. As a curious 14-year-old boy, I arrived at the crater before the area was sealed off. A local military unit came and searched the area for bodies, which were put in a coffin. 3 men were taken prisoner in the area. We didn't know that there were 7 crew. Thanks to Dick's fantastic work, I was able to return to the area on the 2nd of January 1994, the 50th anniversary of our crash. I flew with my son-in-law David Kirk from Manchester to Amsterdam, and then travelled by car driven by Dick Breedich. Our purpose was to visit the graves of my 2 comrades in Hanover War Cemetery and also the crash area where they died. The crash of the Lancaster and the explosion of the bomb load could have been a major disaster for Holtrup or Schweringen, as it took place between them. When we left the site of the crash, we were taken to the coffee house in Holtrup, where we were introduced to Annie Hupper, who is now 82. She was the lady who came to the coffee house when I was taken there after being captured, because she could speak English. She was very pleased to find that I was now wearing shoes. At an informal gathering, Herr Bochmann made a short speech welcoming me to Holtrup and comparing my visit on this occasion with the ill-fated flight 50 years before. He expressed his gratitude for my announcing my current visit, unlike the one I'd made 50 years previously. He also made reference to the German saying that if a person survived a disaster, as I had done, then they were reborn. We should therefore be celebrating my 50th birthday, to which we all drank. Copiously, I have to say. Everybody was very helpful and friendly, and we had a most enjoyable time. During the next day we were shown around the local area where the crew had come down by parachute and the locations where some had been captured. We also travelled around the very boggy area into which I had descended, but I was unable to identify the place where I'd buried my parachute. We then visited the Flugplatz, where 3 of us were taken after we'd been captured, and from there to the railway station. The whole of the area was very much as I'd remembered it, although I did not see much of it in daylight at that time. Before leaving the area, we visited the churchyards where our pilot and navigator were first buried before being transferred to the Hanover War Cemetery. The following day we went to Hanover after making our final visit to the place of the crash and a few calls on the local people we'd met on our visit. We arrived at Hanover War Cemetery next morning and visited the graves of Flight Officer Bryson and Sergeant Roxby, where I laid a wreath in their memory on behalf of the surviving crew members and 550 Squadron. I asked Dick if he would like to add anything to the record of events, and I received the following comment. "I'm very happy to get this opportunity to thank Jim Donnan and all the other ex-RAF members, especially those of Bomber Command, for their enormous input and bravery during World War II. I lived then in that part of Holland that was liberated only after the unconditional surrender by the German occupiers. One of the reasons for this was that the bombings went on until the very last moment. I also want to thank everyone who in one way or another helped in the dropping of food. I'd been born in the year of 1939, and I can remember in those early years of my life the feeling of hunger and the taste of sugar beet and tulip bulbs. And it's now Christmas present time. A long-time supporter of the podcast, Lisa Loftis from America, wrote to me ages ago with this link, and it's taken me until now to make use of it. I've had some fun with it. It's a digital jigsaw, and click on the link in the show notes, and you'll see what it is. So have a bit of fun with it like I have, and thank you very much, Lisa, for your ongoing interest and support of the show. Another little bit of news now. Another long-standing supporter of the show, James Papalia, has produced I think it's his fourth book now. It's called The Secret Portal, My Journey with General Eisenhower. 10-year-old James Papalia thought he was just a regular kid from the Jersey Shore until a mysterious portal transports him back in time to meet his hero, General Dwight D. Eisenhower. From that moment on, James embarks on an incredible journey through history, standing beside one of America's greatest leaders as he rises from small-town Kansas boy to supreme commander and ultimately President of the United States. Follow James on his adventures is the message, and learn at the same time. That's 10-year-old James is 10, and it's aimed at that sort of age group, so if you've got a kid who needs a good little stocking filler for Christmas, there is a link in the show notes. Keep it up, James. Well done, that man. This next story is by Sergeant Len Scott of the RAPC, the Royal Army Pay Corps. The location of the story is in Algiers, North Africa. This is from the BBC People's War website as well. And here we go. Towards the end of November 1943, I began to feel off colour. It became hard to climb the last 2 flights to my 6th floor billet. I finished on hands and knees. I consulted my Dutch messmate. Sergeant Lagas had served with the French Foreign Legion in Syria under General Weygand. He looked at my eye whites critically. "You better go sick. You maybe have jaundice." I told the medical officer of my suspicion, was abused for my self-diagnosis, and told to report as fit for duty. The Dutchman sighed. "Soon you'll be pissing brown and shitting white. Then you go yellow." Correct as to the first event. This time I was examined and a sample taken. Verdict: get your kit together and give this, a scribble, to your CO. I'm sending you to hospital. Brigadier Rabino sighed, sympathised, wished me well, and told his chauffeur to drive me to the hospital, which was not large. It had long since been overwhelmed by casualties from Tunisia and Italy. As an aside, listener, interesting that's where my dad might have been had he got injured during the Tunisia battle. The gardens and adjacent fields were white with marquees, each containing some 30 beds. Beds with sheets! A pillow! I slept until roused by the doctor. Jaundice diagnosis confirmed. I would have a fat-free diet. Must remain in bed and rest. I might expect to leave in about 3 weeks. A wonderful programme. Next morning, 2nd of December, though feeling worse, I wrote to my wife, Mina, of my slight attack of jaundice. This will be a nice holiday. A fat-free diet produces better food than I've eaten for months. I'd groused about army food to Sergeant Laggas, who'd cocked an eyebrow. In the Legion, men would have killed for food half as good as this. In hospital, there's only time present. The view from my bed is restricted to two lumpy shapes, one to the right and another to the left. Shapes which speak of places and people of which I know nothing. Nurses stick thermometers in my mouth. Each morning a doctor peers at me. Food and drink is shovelled into me and the results removed. Above me the canvas roof. My body demands my attention, has no patience with time past, does not wish to consider time future. People can die from jaundice, can't they? A week passed before I took any interest in my surroundings, but Mina had to be given news. I wrote. I'd forgotten the Christmas postal chaos. I'd even forgotten about Christmas. Later I discovered that Mina was told of my illness on 13th of December. A telephone call from Major Gosling, who'd been called to War Office for a briefing. The Major was suitably optimistic, but Mina wanted my own words. Those reached her on 17th of December, by which time, unbeknown to her, I was eating almost normally. Mina wrote of her delight at my Christmas parcel, which contained the mystery gift I'd promised her weeks ago. Mina wrote, I walked round it in ever-decreasing circles, but managed to leave it alone until I'd prepared the surroundings for the opening ceremony, which was accompanied by the Delibus King's diversions, classical piece. Very fitting, don't you think? Your card with Christmas greetings delayed procedure for a little, while I battled with my conscience whether I ought to wait until Christmas Eve. Oh, Len, the stockings are lovely, thank you so much for everything, the ribbons, hairpins, combs and all. Now I shall have to practice putting up my hair. It's almost like playing at being grown up, but the stockings are too precious to wear yet. I just gloat over them, American ones too. How neat your wrapping. Such fun to unwrap the separate little parcels. I took one of your lemons to the office and raffled it in aid of the Red Cross. A girl sold 67 tickets at twopence each, bringing in 18 shillings. I've bought a tiny Christmas tree. The spread will be somewhat meagre, but I will not let that worry me. Mrs. Batley's given me 2 lovely new laid eggs, and I've returned the compliment with a couple of lemons. Major Gosling's phone call brought her, as she wrote later, from the peaks to the depths, and on 21st of December, still no news, but I shall do my best for the honour of the house at Christmas, with the big smile expected from a hostess. Not until 27th of December was she able to write, saved from despair by your very kind brigadier, who phoned me to say that you were on the mend. I've only had 1 letter from you. I felt sure that you'd written. You would never cause me pain. Then on 31st of December, misery ended. 2 letters from you, and I will celebrate New Year's Eve with them alone. I imagine that our house resents intruders as much as I do. 3 weeks of silence. I like your remark that we owe our success to the directness and simplicity of our life. My little attempt to make Christmas seemed insufficient and Spartan, though I remember a much less spectacular Christmas when you and I shared a dinner which came out of a tin. There came a day in Algiers when it rained incessantly, continuing through the night and the following day. That night I awoke to a swishing sound. A nurse was moving down the ward carrying a hurricane lamp, Florence Nightingale, and the swishing was produced by her Wellington boots. My bed was surrounded by water more than a foot deep. Mopping up occupied most of the following morning, with the convalescent patients ordered to volunteer. A fat-free diet did not bar me from quantities of sweets and fruity delicacies. I was childishly delighted at being looked after for the first time since leaving England. Sheets, breakfast in bed. As I snuggled down to reach the borders of sleep, I desired nothing more than to go into a state of suspended animation until the war was over. Awake, I began to take an interest in my fellow patients. Many were Canadians, and I was dumbfounded to learn that one knew one of my friends. His unit had been stationed in Marden Park. Many of his mates had been wounded in Sicily and Italy. I suffered some good-humoured chaffing about the Pay Corps. I discovered that we British were paupers compared with the Canadians, and that the Canadian plutocrats were eclipsed by the Americans. The latter were encouraged to insure their lives for up to $10,000 under a state scheme. They would draw huge gratuities on demobilisation. We uninsured British would get sixpence a day from January 1942. A sergeant of the same grade as myself drew £12 10 weekly, compared with my £3 odd, while his rations made mine look like Oliver Twist's breakfast on a bad day. A different world. Christmas Eve brought sunshine and an incredibly blue sky. The first Christmas in Palestine must have been like this. The wards were decorated as best we could. We had a fir tree adorned with cotton wool and stars cut from tin cans. No one had found mistletoe. Kissing a member of the Quames, Queen Alexandra's Imperial Military Nursing Service, was unimaginable. All were officers. The padre and a nurse toured the wards, giving each man a packet of cigarettes and an orange. Kindly meant, but the chill touch of organised benevolence. A party of nurses and patients sang carols outside each ward, but our northern songs of Yule sounded alien in Africa. A few Arabs, their white robes glimmering in the darkness, gazed curiously at the strange foreigners with their incomprehensible customs. Yes, I thought, we are the most transient of visitors. The Romans, the Byzantines, even the Vandals had struck deep roots here over many years, and traces remain. When we go, we shall leave no impression on this place. The tents will come down, the lorries roar away, and we shall achieve perhaps a passing remembrance among the shoeshine boys who've learned our swear words and waxed passing rich on our francs. Ramadan is the solemnity here, and Christmas a pale guest from the north, bemused by vivid, unaccustomed colours, discouraged by the millions who've never heard of it. Outside, amid masses of green foliage, peer the tawny gold globes of oranges. In the hedgerows, iris blooms in blue splendour, and there are roses, great blousy pink roses, like prosperous barmaids. One ward has erected a splendidly decorated Christmas tree outside their marquee, but alas, the Mediterranean goats assemble and chew happily at the lower branches. Depression steals among the still jaundiced. The rumour has spread that the state of their livers precludes beer. The rumour is confirmed. Worse, Christmas pudding is forbidden fruit for those still abed, and roast potatoes are interdict. All these delicacies appear for up patience, in which happy band am I. Tinned turkey too, with pork, peas, tangerine oranges, and a bottle of beer. Then comes the order. Stand by your beds for inspection. There are suppressed giggles, and when matron reaches my bed, I recognise, beneath the uniform, headdress, mascara and lipstick, the cheerful features of our medical officer. I think it's a bloke. But the best gift I have on Christmas Day is a couple of letters from Mina. I've made splendid progress, measured by the increasing number of fatigues I have to perform. I'm placed in charge of ward administration, diet records and meal lists. Another new experience. I'm rather weak when I have my first full day up, but on the second I walk about a mile within the hospital grounds. On the third day I'm almost normal and with an abnormal appetite. I leave hospital on 29th of December with my papers marked Return to Unit, Fit for Duty. Had I appeared wan and weak, I should have been sent to a dreaded convalescent depot where 15-mile route marches and 5-mile cross-country runs are the rough therapies. In a few days it will be 1944. How long before I walk up the 100 steps to reach our hilltop home and Mina? I just want to draw your attention now to a cartoon I've seen, it depicts a prisoner of war camp with a German guard in his little tower pointing down over the prison buildings. And there's a big barbed wire fence just in front of him, and Santa Claus with a sack, and he's obviously climbing out of the camp because the guard's pointing to say get back in, and Santa's saying, but I assure you, my dear chap, I really am Father Christmas. Oh dear. Right, this is a true story from the late veteran Wilf Shaw, and it's one he told me a few years ago, which no one has ever heard before, but I've been keeping it for such an occasion. It relates to when he and his comrades were fighting their way through France after the Normandy invasion, and they're on patrol through a small village around Christmas time, and Wilf spots a small church just 100 yards away in a field. So he's been through a lot, so he decides he'll pop in to pay his respects to the Lord and make confession at the same time. So he goes inside and finds the confession boxes. He draws the curtain, goes in, sits down, and while he's waiting for the priest, he looks around the box and is most impressed. It's full of Christmas surprises. There's a box of cigars on the shelf next to him, chocolates, and even a bottle of Calvados with a glass. And there's a few paper decorations on the ceiling, and it's all gently lit by a Christmassy shimmering candle. And while Wilf's pondering the seasonal generosity of the local priest, the father suddenly sticks his head around the curtain and sees Wilf sitting there with all his army gear on. Wilf greets the priest with a grin and says, "Father, I can't say how impressed I am with all these Christmas goodies, and not a single tin of bully beef in sight. Thank you so much." The priest says, "What are you talking about? Get out of here. You're on the wrong side." Wait. We're now on the PS. We're coming to a close now with a beautiful, poignant Christmas story from the BBC People's War website. And this features a girl or a lady called Elizabeth Herneman. And it reads as follows. It was Christmas morning, 1943, and my present was a second-hand Humber bike with a basket in front. They were quite the thing to have in those days. Mother filled the basket with a huge bag of toffees, and so I took it for a ride, came down Saunton Hill, just as the German prisoners, these are prisoners in England, who were being kept at what was the Saunton Golf Club, were being marched down. So I stopped the bike, took out my bag of toffees, and they all stopped, and I gave them all a toffee and wished them a happy Christmas. One of them said Merry Christmas back to me in German, and he was crying, and that always stuck in my mind. 20 years later, I had 2 children of my own. I went to visit my mother-in-law in the farm in Croyd. I picked up one of her copies of Woman's Weekly, and the star letter was from a lady who said her husband would always remember, as a prisoner of war in Saunton on Christmas Day, a little fair-haired girl stopped her bike, gave them some sweets, and wished them happy Christmas. And I knew I was that girl, and that was lovely. It turned out he'd been moved to Oxfordshire and had met an English girl. They married, and every Christmas morning he talked about that little fair-haired girl and how she wasn't afraid. And I'm always glad I stopped. I'm always so glad I stopped. I'm Paul Cheall saying, I've got to go now. I've got presents to wrap. Have a great Christmas and a Happy New Year. Thank you for all your support during the last God knows how long. I really do appreciate it. Keep listening, keep following, and tell your friends when you get the chance. Happy Christmas, everybody. Bye-bye for now. Did you cry? I did. Bye-bye. Happy Christmas.